Hey everybody, this is your TA Simon from Lee Ivy's HS-131 Fruit and Vegetable Production. The year is 2021. Just as a side note, I was out with some of you guys earlier today at HFL. We got a lot of work done. Really nice to put some names to faces finally. I wish we could spend more time in person. Um, you've probably heard me talk about plant breeding. It's something I'm passionate about, and I realize it can be kind of a difficult topic for people to get into. Breeders can either be a little bit too academic about it, or they can be a little bit flaky about it and not give you reliable information. So my goal today is to give you a meaningful surface level look at plant breeding and just some tips and some details on how you can actually do plant breeding at home. So I got into plant breeding. Really, I didn't know this was a career option until I worked with a plant breeder. His name is Dr. Pat Hayes. He's at Oregon State, and he does barley breeding for malt production for beer. So of course, I had a great time working with him. And before I worked with him and learned a little more about how breeding is done, I kind of lived on the assumption that plant breeding was done by our ancestors, right? Most plants were selected over hundreds, if not thousands of years. It was done really slowly, and incrementally we made progress with our crops, and that's the crops we have today. That's not entirely wrong, but nowadays we have advanced tools and technologies that allow us to do these things a lot faster. I'm not saying you guys need to employ those tools in your home breeding program, but we can take advantage of some of the knowledge we've gained through science over the decades. Um, so I want you guys to know that if you decide to do some plant breeding, depending on the crop, you can realistically create a stable new variety in a decade or perhaps less time at home or in a greenhouse. A lot of the traits of interest that big public institutions or companies like Syngenta wouldn't necessarily pay attention to, these might be traits that you guys are exceptionally interested in as home breeders. Janine Davis talked about those tiny potatoes, right, that are selling for more money now than the big ones. Um, you see variegated plants a lot of the time. My girlfriend saw it was variegated Monstera deliciosa on Etsy, and they were selling for like a couple $100 a cutting. And this is just a small little 1 or 2 inch piece of it. Um, Off colors, interesting dwarfing types, things that wouldn't really make sense in an agricultural setting, but could be highlighted in a home garden or a greenhouse. And there's so many traits of interest. We'll talk about those more in a bit. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So again, some of these new techniques and technologies can be a bit intimidating, but that's not my goal. My goal is to show you guys how kind of our ancestors did plant breeding, but with some of the knowledge we have nowadays that we can, do a little bit more targeted plant breeding at home and in a reasonable amount of time. So here's like the briefest, most condensed history of plant breeding that I can come up with. 10,000, really 12,000 years ago, dawn of agriculture, right? The Neolithic Revolution, where we slowly started shifting away from hunter-gatherer and started growing plants, somewhere around the Fertile Crescent. You could have to ask an anthropologist for more details. Then in the 1800s, we have Charles Darwin write The Origin of the Species, and that kind of shook the world when we discovered evolution, which had really been there the whole time. Gregor Mendel was kind of the first geneticist, the father of genetics, if you will, and he published this work. Um, I believe that translates to the experiments on plant hybridization, and he came up with the theory of genetics that we still employ today, Mendelian genetics. Um, and really, since those two publications, between then and now, that's when all modern plant breeding, all science-driven plant breeding, has occurred. So I pitched to you guys the question: which group has contributed more to humanity? Professional breeders and scientists who've been doing this for about 150 to 200 years, or was it amateur breeders doing it in their home gardens on small family plots who've been doing it for 12,000 years? You put those two numbers side by side, and it's apparent that hobby breeding actually was breeding in all of breeding for most of human history. Let's clarify some terminology because I hear these words misused a lot of the time. So Species is a group of plants that share common characteristics and can interbreed. Zea mays, over here I've got corn as an example. Zea mays is a species. There's lots of other things below the species level, but generally speaking, when we're talking about a species, we're talking about at the taxonomic level. A variety is a distinct lineage below the species level, and varieties can occur naturally. A certain type of tree morphology can be a variety, and these, because they're a subspecies, right, or a taxonomic class below species, they can still interbreed with one another. My example here is Daucus carota, variety sativus. That's the carrot. This variety was observed in Afghanistan, and a lot of the carrots we have nowadays have come from those naturally occurring varieties. A subvariety that occurs in cultivation is a cultivar. And so you can have a variety and a cultivar and still be a species, right? So Daucus is the genus, Carota is the specific epithet of that genus. And then your variety is still sativus, but the cultivar in single quotes is purple dragon. This is just the purple dragon carrot. A cultivar may or may not seed true. You can release an F1 hybrid as a cultivar, and I'll explain details on that in a little bit. An heirloom is really just an old cultivar, and it doesn't even need to be old. This is a bit of a nebulous definition, and I'm sure some people would disagree with my definitions here, but this is as distilled as I can make it. And an heirloom is maintained by, home gardeners or farmers, particularly in isolated communities or ethnic groups in the Western world. A hybrid can be really a cross between any of these two things. It can be a cross between two species, two cultivars, or two heirlooms. An F1 hybrid is a specific type of hybrid. And generally speaking, we're talking about two inbred parents that cross and form a new, better version of a plant than either of the parents were alone. Taking a step back, why do we breed plants, right? We've already got perfectly good tomatoes. Well, things change, the environment changes, new diseases emerge that we have to adapt and adjust to. And this is the task of a lot of those big institutions, like NC State, like Syngenta or Monsanto. I guess Monsanto doesn't exist anymore, but whatever company that's become. And the goals of these big institutions, like universities and companies, they need to make money, and so they need to apply for grants or appease the big wigs or the consumers who are funding their products. And their focus is really on things like yield and changing climate, so shifts in water regimes and drought tolerance, etc. We also talk a lot about disease and insect resistances, at least in my experience with public breeding. A hobby breeder, like maybe yourself, maybe one day soon, can pick any traits at all to work with. And so you have unlimited creative opportunities. You're unhindered by the dollar, although I should point out that you can make money doing this, and I will list some individuals who've made quite a bit of money doing plant breeding, more or less on a small scale. Your focus can be on things like quality, right? You can make a better tasting tomato that might not store as long on the shelf, but that doesn't matter because you're growing it for home consumption. Or something like novelty, an interesting color like the brown Kumamoto tomato. Flavor traits, obviously aesthetics, the list goes on for traits we can play with. But we will need a little bit of science and math to continue, and so I'll briefly go over some of these concepts. And if you guys want to learn more, feel free to ask me, or you can read more on the subject online. These four images on the bottom here, I think I lifted these from a UK seed catalog, and these were selections made by people who grew seeds they purchased from that company. And then the company bought interesting seeds back and released cultivars, which I think is genius as a company, but really those hobby breeders could have made their own varieties. This one I'd never seen before. It's called, I think they called it Flamethrower Nasturtium. I wouldn't mind planting that in my yard. They look pretty cool. So let's just take a quick and dirty look at genetics because it's important, and we'll revisit some of these topics in a bit, but I don't want to bog you guys down with a ton of information. I think really just if you can look at the pictures and listen to me drone on, I think you'll probably catch uh, you'll skim off what I'm hoping to get pass along to you guys. So plants can reproduce sexually or asexually, or sometimes both, right? A lavender plant can produce seeds, but maybe we're propagating it by cuttings more often. Sexual recombination, or excuse me, sexual reproduction is driven by recombination. So that's kind of it's analogous to shuffling a deck of cards. It's a shuffling of the parental genetic materials. So offspring might have some aspects of mom, some aspects of dad. They might look like a blend of their parents, and sometimes if you get two recessive genes, one from each of your parents, you can have a different trait expressed that neither of your parents had. I'm a good example. I have red hair, and my eyes are a different color than either of my parents. So I probably have some recessive genes that they both carried but were not expressed. So that just is a long way of saying seeds are not always the same as the parent plants, or at least they don't the progeny don't always look like the parents, right? But in breeding, our goal is to make that not the case. We want something that we can save seed from, plant it, and it looks just like the parent plant did. And we want that to be true year after year after year, so we can have something like an heirloom tomato. An heirloom tomato will do that, right? It'll grow true from its own seed, provided that no foreign pollen got into that tomato's flower. Something like an F1 hybrid you will not be able to save seed from. And companies can exploit this by selling seed that you can only buy once. If you save that seed, it'll grow into something different. And I'll explain exactly how that works in a moment. I should point out that some plants don't tolerate this kind of stabilization we're talking about, where you self it again and again and again. Although many plants do and will tolerate this, it's not always the case, and that may be something you need to do a little more research on with whatever species you choose to breed with. And I'll share these slides with you guys, or I guess if you're watching this on YouTube, you can just pause it. But here's some other topics you can you can read up on if you're not already well versed. Um, and so plants that don't tolerate that inbreeding, we may have to propagate them a different way. We do this with sweet potato. They don't tolerate inbreeding at all, really. So we need to propagate them clonally, or we need to cross them with a different parent and then propagate the seedlings that we select clonally. A lot of orchard trees are grown this way, right? You maybe have heard if you plant an apple seed from something you buy at the store, it's not going to look anything like the apple you're eating right now. A lot of times house plants are clonally propagated. Again, I bring up this variegated monstera, which is absolutely stunning. Um, it's variegated and it has this white leaf pattern on it, which in nature, it's not photosynthesizing there. This would probably just die off. But as hobby breeders, as people who celebrate these diverse, interesting off types, we want to celebrate this, right? So we're going to sell cuttings of it, and we're going to make a bunch of money. A mature plant of this, I think it's Monstera deliciosa. They're calling it variety alba. I'm not sure if it is a true variety, but the cuttings are like 150 bucks a pop, and a mature plant has sold for up to $5,000. Bear in mind, these are cheap plants. If you get into orchid selling, you're talking about $200,000 or more for a single plant. So if someone tells you you can't make money breeding, they're lying to you. Um, this is what I would consider a chimera, and that really just means monster. Um, and a chimera is a union of two different genotypes or two different genetic bases. You could actually make a chimera by grafting a plant, right? Because it does represent two distinct gene pools that are married into a single individual. So if you grow a cherry tree at home, chances are it's grafted onto a rootstock. Um, Grafted tomatoes as well are becoming increasingly popular. A more vigorous rootstock results in a higher yield above ground that maybe has some more disease resistances. These are examples of chimeras. Um, I think I've talked enough about asexual reproduction, but I think it's important to know that there's a reason that we do some plants this way, that we propagate some plants this way. And if you were to try and breed with asexually reproduced plants, it might be a little more difficult to actually come up with a stable variety. And so propagating is one way to capture a plant in the state that you want it. Another important consideration is ploidy. This is getting into the weeds a little bit on the genetic side of things, but I want you guys to be able to recognize when a plant is a reasonable target to breed with. So I think example is the easiest way to explain ploidy. Humans are diploid, right? So two ploid. We have half our genetics from mom, half from dad. One set of chromosomes are contributed from either parent. A diploid plant is exactly the same way. It gets half from mom, half from dad. But plants, unlike people, can fertilize themselves and reproduce year after year without deleterious effects in most cases. This is the basis for an inbred variety, and a diploid plant is easy to work with. So this might be one of the targets you start with. Examples are peppers, tomatoes, corn is a diploid, pea, guava, grape, kidney bean, a bunch of other beans, some onions, tobacco, seeded watermelon, but not seedless watermelon. Some orchids are diploids, like the Cymbidium genus. I don't know if all Cymbidium are, but that's something you'd need to look up on your own. Um, really, about half of flowering plants, angiosperms, are diploid. But some plants can have different ploidy levels. I point your attention to the strawberry picture. You may have harvested wild strawberries around here that are generally diploid. They taste great, but they're nothing in size comparison to some of these cultivated ones, which tend to be polyploids. And polyploids have more than one set of chromosomes from each parent. Sweet potato, sweet potato, strawberry, potato, banana, wheat, seedless watermelon is a triploid. Peanut, blackberry. Some of these may also be diploids in the wild or have diploid accessions in people's gardens around the world. And again, it's still probably 30 to 70% or around that 50% mark of plants that are polyploid, but there's some overlap between the two. This is a topic that once you're a little more well versed on breeding, you should really look into about your crop. But I don't want you guys to get super excited about breeding bananas in your home garden and then realize that it's really, really hard to breed bananas. So, if you can just figure out, generally speaking, if it's diploid or not, I think that's a good place to start. We can talk more about this if anyone's interested, but I don't want to dwell on it. Let's just jump into kind of the physiology of breeding. So you need to know what kind of flower your plant has. A perfect flower is kind of your stereotypical, sometimes they call it a normal flower. And this is when the male and female organs are within the same flower. A lot of garden type flowers look like this. Peppers, tomatoes, sweet potatoes. I could write pages on what perfect flowers are. And then there's imperfect flowers, and would be when the male and female organs are on separate, distinct flowers on the same plant. Um, Rather, if they're on the same plant, it would be considered monoecious. So one plant, but both flowers. And if the male and female flowers are on separate individuals, it would be considered dioecious. A monoecious crop would be corn, right? You got a field of workers here going through and making sure all the tassels are cut off. Tassels are the pollen bearing flower of the corn. And the silk on the tips of the ears, that's the female part, right? Because it has seeds on it. Those silks are where the pollen will germinate and grow down and fertilize the ovule, as opposed to dioecious, where they're separate plants. Where I'm from in the Northwest, a lot of home gardeners like to grow kiwis. And you hear it all the time. Why isn't my kiwi bearing fruit? Well, you only planted one, and you planted a male, and your neighbor's not growing kiwi. So, rather, if you planted a female only and your neighbor didn't have a male plant, you'd never, ever, ever get kiwi fruit. So you need to plant both a male and a female and probably put them close to each other. Hemp is another dioecious plant, although I think there can be male and female flowers on one, so it could be dioecious or monoecious. Asparagus, we'd never really think about planting multiple um, multiple genders because we're just harvesting the vegetative tissue. But if you were to breed with asparagus, you'd need male and female plants. You can't eat the berries, so. Another consideration with flowering, how long does it take? Is this a plant that you can grow in a season, flower, and collect seeds from, like a tomato, great. Your job's a lot easier than your friend who's trying to breed peaches and really would probably have to tell his or her grandchildren about what their goals are, because trees can take decades before they flower. Grafting can speed that up, and we've got lots of ways to do that. I'm sure you guys know more about production than I do. But generally, I want you guys to remember that a diploid annual flowering plant is the easiest place to start. So that brings me to peppers and tomatoes. These are really, really easy to breed with. They're really forgiving plants, and the risk is really worth the reward. So these plants and a lot of other solanaceous plants, potatoes, goji berries, petunias, these are things that someone could theoretically breed at home. Maybe not so much potato, uh, but I digress. They flower within a single season. They're easy to grow in North Carolina. Um, your great grandmother was probably a contributor to some of these heirloom varieties that we still grow today. Um, you're probably growing these already in your garden, so why not customize them to suit your tastes or the aesthetic you want to have in your yard? Maybe you want a shorter plant because you're not very tall and it's hard to pick tomatoes that are 10 feet in the air. Um, these plants have really broad and widely available germplasm. And germplasm is really just what genetic material is available, right? So what species, what varieties, what cultivars do you have to breed with? Of course, the best consideration of all these are delicious plants. And I know I eat peppers every day. Most people probably have tomatoes in some form or another every day. One thing to consider, these are actually perennial plants. They can grow year after year after year, provided you dig them up and put them in your greenhouse or grow them in pots. And so if you keep them flowering through the winter under grow lights, you could potentially be getting um, multiple breeding seasons in a single year. So you can expedite your breeding process with peppers, and that's what a lot of people do. Really, any diploid, perfect flowering, so male and female in the same plant would be a great place to start. Learning about breeding, practicing breeding, refining your techniques, and then jump into other stuff, because there are hobby breeders that work on trees too. So if we were doing this talk live, I would ask you guys questions, but I'll just answer them here for you. So this is a sweet potato. I took this picture on the bottom. This is just some of the beautiful segregating populations you see, and this is in uh, just a cross between two parents, a purple and an orange, and we get everything. Uh, and these were just grown in the greenhouse. But in the field, you'd see all kinds of different morphologies as well. Not to mention the leaf shapes would be all wildly different. So sweet potato is a perfect flower. This diagram here shows the stigma. That's the female, um, one of the female organs upon which pollen will land and germinate and fertilize the ovary. And it's surrounded by these stamens, which have anthers on the end, and those anthers bear pollen. So everything's contained within one structure. A bee can come in, knock these two together, and it'll pollinate and it'll produce little seeds. Here's another one, and this is a plant that, while there are huge breeding operations working on corn, it's something a hobby breeder can still target. This guy is Carl Barnes. He was a farmer. I think he's since passed away, but he created this glass gem corn in, I think it was around 2012. He never really released the variety. It was popularized on Facebook of all places, just by people nerding out about the cool diversity of their plants. As I mentioned, corn is monoecious, so it's a single plant, but it has separate male flowers, that's the tassels up top, and female flowers, which are on the tips of the ears. We talked a good bit about hemp in this class. Hemp is a dioecious plant, usually, so the male and female flowers are on different plants, but it can be monoecious. I've heard that you can have both flower types on a single plant. Really, there's no shortage of hobby breeders working with this family of plants, or perhaps the more nefarious cousin of hemp. Uh, but this is kind of a fun thought, this is a fun question. If you wanted to grow hemp for fiber versus hemp for grains, what kind of plants would you need? If you're growing for fiber, since you're not harvesting fertilized propagules, right? You're not trying to get the seed off it. You just need biomass. So you could probably plant male or female plants. I don't think it would matter, but maybe a hemp grower would disagree. Um, I'd like to have that conversation. If you were trying to grow grain, though, you would need to have males present in your field because you need pollen from those males to land on the female flowers either by wind or by insects, fertilize it, and produce the actual little fruits that we harvest as grain. This is another crop I work with. I don't know if you guys remember what plant that is, but if you look over here at these leaves, I think they're pretty telling. This is potato, and breeders are in the business of picking potato berries, right? This is a true fruit with seeds inside. Potatoes are a perfect flower. You can see there's a couple different genotypes, um, or just genetically distinct individuals. And these are the anthers up the side in yellow. And this right here, a little bit on the tip, is the stigma, where the pollen will land when a bee visits. And then you get berries with 50 to 200, 250 seeds in there. And you can plant them out, and you get a whole bunch of different potatoes to choose from. A little bit more on potatoes. So this is a picture of, believe it or not, potatoes from the Andes collected during an expedition. And these people found in one community of less than 500 people, they had 70 different varieties of potato. That's absolutely staggering. And you know, these aren't varieties produced in a lab or anything. This is just germplasm that's been collected and selected for particular culinary uses or perhaps medicinal uses over hundreds, thousands of years. We don't eat this kind of potato in the US, right? We maybe eat the russet Burbank, maybe the red skin or yellow skin potatoes, but as a breeder, you get excited about this kind of stuff and you want to grow it in your garden. You want to mix the genetics and see what kind of stuff you can come up with. And that's important. Part of hobby breeding can be maintaining genetic diversity outside of areas that might be threatened, right? Here's a statistic that's a little sobering. We have 151 species of potato, right? So there's thousands of varieties within each species, potentially. And 13 of these species may not exist by 2050, probably due to land use change, people getting moved, deforestation, etc. So this is something, you know, we could potentially be playing with in our backyards. Here's another guy that plays in his backyard. He's a YouTuber. I don't know if it's his real name, but he goes by Kang Star with 2 R's. And I think he's in Texas, but he's growing peppers in these cloth bags, and he does some hydroponics, I think, in his kitchen. I've seen a couple of his videos, but he's actually making some hybrid pepper varieties and stabilizing them, and then freely disseminating the seed to people who are interested, on the stipulation that you cannot sell seed for his varieties. You can only gift or trade them. I actually I got some seed from another hobby breeder and grew. So this one is the Lemon Starburst, I think he's calling it, and it came out around 2018. I've got one here. So this big picture's from my garden, and this was early in the season, maybe in, you know, second week of July. My peppers really picked up. You wouldn't be able to see the counter later in the season. But this little orange guy here is another one of his varieties called King Star-Kissed Peach, I think it's called. But yeah, it's fun. You know, get in with these people, and sometimes you'll just get free seeds and interesting stuff to try out in your garden. Since we're doing perfect or imperfect, this is a perfect flower. You see there's the stigma where the pollen will land. There's anthers where the pollen comes from. And here's the, you know, basically a primordial pepper. It's got these unfertilized things in here that'll become pepper seeds. I like to, anytime I talk to people about breeding, I love to show this picture. This is a single species, Brassica oleracea. It looks kind of like a mustard plant. And all of these different vegetables that we eat, some of which you might like and some of which you might hate, are all really the same thing, genetically speaking. Cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, I've got up here, some people call it Broccoflower. I think I've seen it as Romanesco in the farmer's market. There's one important one missing. I'll give you a second to try and guess what that is, but I'll give you a hint. We're in North Carolina. Collards. Collards is also Brassica oleracea. Um, so that's just, it's just so fun to think that these are all, the same species. What are, in your guys' minds, what are some other crops with tremendous diversity to them? What crops do you see at the grocery store or at the farmer's market that you'd like to see more diversity in? Because I bet you that diversity's out there, whether that's in color, flavor, if you're into ornamentals, maybe it's the scent or the aesthetics. What are some traits that are missing that maybe a breeder could fix? And I'm not talking about disease resistance, although you could certainly make a career out of disease resistance. But what if you just wanted a tomato to taste more tomatoey? That's something you could do at home. Lastly, when are you going to start? The growing season's upon us. I think, yeah, I think we're safe from any more frosts. I'm going to put my peppers out this weekend. So, what are you guys going to start breeding with this year? And we could take this, this crazy variation a step further and say, what if we made crosses between different species? Because some plants allow you to do that. If we see such diversity within a single group, imagine if we combine two groups. Interspecific hybrids are a key way of introgressing disease resistance traits, other things in big public breeding programs. But it's something you could certainly do at home too. I like to think about this a lot and say, with the rate things are changing and new crops are popping up in the grocery stores, maybe some of the vegetables our kids or our grandkids are going to love to eat or maybe hate, they don't even exist yet. So let's get to the mechanics of plant breeding. And this is really, excuse me, I need some water. This is really the steak and potatoes of breeding, so to speak. In order to make a cross, right? Let's assume we're talking about a perfect flower, like I recommended you guys start with. You need to emasculate them, which means remove the male organs so it doesn't self-fertilize. Because initially speaking, we're trying to make a cross, right? Bring a white flower and a red flower together to make a pink one. Perfect flowers are going to self-pollinate for the most part, unless we take those male organs off. So before the flower bud opens, and I say that because in this little picture here, this person's emasculating after the flower is open. That's too late because this pollen could already have arrived and fertilized itself. But before the flower opens, you want to take these male organs off. Then you just need to collect pollen from an open flower and introduce it to the stigma of your emasculated flower. At this point, put a little tag on a string around it saying what the cross is and put a bag over it. You can do a paper bag or these, I think it's called organza. I use bags like this at home. I got them from a wedding supply website, like 1,000 of them for $5 for putting shells or candles. I don't know what people use them for outside of breeding, but what these bags do is they exclude insects and wind from bringing pollen in from other plants. And once you see a little fruit, I think this is a pepper plant here, once these start to fruit, you can take the bag off and it'll hopefully have a tag on there and you'll know that the fruit is set and the seeds within that fruit are going to represent the cross you just made. That's pretty cool. And that's really all it takes to make your initial hybrid cross. If you are working with a crop I haven't talked about today, or you're not sure how to do this because I'm being a little bit vague, just search on YouTube, pepper emasculation or okra emasculation, and there's hundreds of videos on people all over the world doing it. Here's another plant created by a hobby breeder. This was my mom's favorite flower, the Stargazer lily. Bred in 1974, so this is not ancient history. And what's cool about Stargazer, so it's not named that because it has this kind of characteristic yellow star, but it's actually a lot of lilies face this way, kind of facing the ground. And Stargazer was bred to face upwards. Also, it has a fantastic smell, so there's a cool little bit of history about this one. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the genetics of things, and if you guys don't want to hear about it, that's fine. Put me on mute and go back to your video games or whatever. But I think it's important to kind of elucidate why we need to breed plants year after year after year and stabilize them. And hopefully this can kind of illuminate why that is. So let's say we want to create a round green pea. And the plants we start with are round and yellow. These are our dominant traits. So big R, big R, big Y, big Y. And we cross this with our wrinkled green pea. These are recessive traits. We want to capture the little y's, which represent green, but we don't want wrinkled. Well, the gametes that these two parents can form are limited to what genes they have to work with, right? So since this parent, we'll call it the maternal line, the mom, this parent only has two potential gametes it can form, little r and little y. And this parent we'll call the dad, only has two potential gametes it can form. Gametes are the sex cells. Think like a sperm and an egg. So these can only form big R, big Y. What you get when you cross them is what we'd call an F1 hybrid. And it has genetics from both parents. So it's big R, big Y, little y. It looks just like, I think we called this one the dad, because these are dominant traits. Round and yellow are dominant. So you don't really know that this wrinkled green thing was the mom, but it's in the genetics. And if you were to then take these F1 plants and cross them with each other, you'd get what we call segregation. Generally speaking, in an inbred crop, segregation happens at the F2 generation. So that's 2 generations removed from the parents. And so now we do actually start to see some of the ideal types we're trying to recover, right? We see a round green pea. We see it 3 times, or 3 out of 16 total occurrences have the phenotype or the appearance that we want. So what we'd do if we're breeding for round green peas is we'd go through our field and we'd cull out or kill all the plants that are round and yellow, or wrinkly and yellow, or wrinkly and green. And we'd be left with just round green peas. And that's it, right? We're done. We've made a variety. No, that's not it. Because if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that while we do have one individual with our ideal type and it's homozygous, we have 2 individuals that are still carrying that little r. And if we were to cross these, you could potentially form a little r, little y gamete. And if these 2 plants crossed, you might get yellow stuff again. Despite none of these 3 individuals appearing yellow, that yellow is still there in the genetics. So what we then need to do is make multiple generations of crossing our ideal types and culling out everything we don't want. And we call this selection. How many generations? Well, I think generally speaking, you want at least 8 generations before you can call something a more or less stable variety. And the word we use in genetics is homozygous, or it's the same at both of these loci within a gene. And a loci is just a fancy word for a location. So yeah, we want to dilute the unwanted traits and essentially cull them completely out of our population until everything has the traits we want. And since we're going for, we want the round, which is the big R, and we want the green, which is the little y. I know this terminology can be a little bit confusing. It took me some years to get this, but you can refer back to these slides. I'm pretty sure I've got this accurate. If it's still confusing, you can always search, Mendelian genetics and learn a lot more about this. Another search phrase could be Punnett square. But the big takeaway here is, if you're in a home breeding operation, just know that you really should make at least 8 rounds of selection before you can be confident something is a stable variety. So let's kind of wrap it up with the key points that I've tried to make today. First and foremost, plant breeding is easy. It's something that millions of people have done before you, and they did it with fewer tools and less education. And a lot of the time, they didn't know they were doing it, right? They just picked a nice ear of corn or a head of wheat, and that's the one they saved seed for, and slowly, incrementally made progress. Well, now, we kind of know what's going on behind the scenes. And so we can use some of that information to inform our decision-making process, and you can be something of a citizen scientist. Also, some plants are easier to breed than others. So I really, really strongly recommend you do some research on the ploidy of your plant or the physiology and see what kind of flowers it has before you decide to plant 100 acres of bananas and realize that it's really hard to breed with bananas. Plant breeding does take time, and even with a greenhouse, you're often limited to 2 generations a year. You can do this at home, with the greenhouse. In big breeding programs, I spoke with Dr. Jeff Dunn in peanut breeding, and they actually have a greenhouse or a field production in the southern hemisphere during our winter here in North Carolina. So he can get 2 seasons in a single year. But regardless of what approach you use, it does take years to release a variety. And that's because you need to wait for a plant to mature and bear fruit, and those fruit need to become physiologically mature, which means the seed inside are ready to become plants. That usually means letting those fruits sit a little bit longer than if you were to harvest it, right? A green bell pepper might not be as mature as the peppers they're collecting seeds from. And this can take longer for perennial plants and trees, obviously. Those can take decades to grow. Remember this, if you buy F1 seeds from the garden center, it's probably going to be a great looking plant, good yields, but know that it will not produce seed that look identical to that parent plant. It may be a cultivar, but it's not a variety. An heirloom plant, on the other hand, will be stable, hopefully, unless it was cross-pollinated. But you can generally trust that an heirloom tomato, if you save seeds from that, is going to grow into the same tomato. If you're online buying seeds, I'm not going to point this guy out or anything, but there's a guy selling F3 seeds. And if we go back to those slides I was talking about segregation patterns, there's a very good chance that if you grew seeds from these F3 peppers, they'd look nothing like the parent, right? And that's why they're the cheapest seeds on his website. You're taking a risk if you're planting anything F2, 3, 4, etc. At the F8 level, assuming the breeder was responsible and made some selections and put a little pressure on their population to move it towards their ideal type, then after the F8 level, you're safe. And they wouldn't sell this as, an F8 snow pea. They'd just sell it as a variety, right? Sugar snap pea. That's essentially, this is how you develop an heirloom variety of your own. The only difference being it's not 50 years old. And I want to kind of close today with some thoughts on this guy. This is Luther Burbank. He had some interesting ideas, maybe a little bit off color for today's. I think he was into eugenics, if you know what that is, but he nevertheless was a very important hobby plant breeder. And I've got a quote from him that says, "The secret of improved plant breeding, apart from scientific knowledge, is love." And then I have a recent quote. So Luther Burbank was way back in the day, but I have this Purdue professor that says, "Burbank cannot be considered a scientist in the academic sense." And it's interesting to have the kind of dichotomy between these two quotes. Luther Burbank, you notice, is not Dr. Luther Burbank, but he was a plant breeder and he did some important things. If you notice this here, you'd say, oh, that's a potato. What type of potato is it, though? That's a russet potato, and a russet potato is a sport of the Burbank potato. When Luther Burbank was 18, his dad died and left him some money, so he bought, a moderately sized piece of land, started growing potatoes, started breeding potatoes and making selections. This guy is a hobby breeder, and he made one of the most important varieties that we eat just about every day, whether you're going to McDonald's or a fancy restaurant or cooking cheaply for yourself at home. So we have a lot to owe to hobby breeders, and I hope that this talk has kind of even if you don't take any information away from this about the genetics and the physiology, I just want you guys to get a little bit excited about this and know that hobby breeding is something you can and probably should be doing at home. So yeah, thanks for listening to me drone on about this topic I'm excited about. Hopefully I've passed some of that excitement along to you guys. Take care, everyone.